Yeah. So it's been, like 2 weeks since I've posted anything about this coaching education journey. But I wanted a bit more time to come up with a better topic or something better to talk about. And as such, I now have a bit of some notes regarding what I wanted to talk about. Recently read a 2012 ACSM article titled Prevention, Diagnosis, and Treatment of the Overtraining Syndrome, Joint Consensus Statement of the European College of Sport Science and the American College of Sports Medicine. There's like 9 authors on this thing, and definitely is obviously a joint consensus. But it's regarding overtraining syndrome, overreaching, the definitions between the two, and how hard it is to diagnose whether someone is actually overtrained or if it's more, if there's something more. It's difficult to obtain enough objective data in order to accurately determine an athlete's status. The best way to determine if an athlete's actually overtrained requires a lot of long-term monitoring. You need training blogs, both objective and subjective. Since things like psychological stress, you're in class all day and you just failed an exam, or your boyfriend or girlfriend just broke up with you, and that's been like stressing you out. The thing with that is that stress is stress. You're going to respond to it the same way. Your body responds to it the same way. So monitoring things like training load as well as other subjective information is going to be a big thing in determining overtraining syndrome. They've also called it unexplained underperformance syndrome. But I mean, there's just far too many variables to really be able to accurately diagnose someone doing that, especially since if you work with like high school kids, maybe you only see them a couple months out of the year. But if you're a coach who works with athletes over a longer period of time, you're probably more able to accurately assess a lot of those different things. The physiological, the psychological, and environmental, basically all the internal and external variables affecting the system and the athlete as a whole. There's various definitions, and I'll read you a little bit of it. The basics between overreaching and overtraining. Overreaching is an accumulation of training and or non-training stress resulting in a short-term decrement in performance capacity with or without related physiological and psychological signs and symptoms of maladaptations in which restoration of performance capacity may take from several days to several weeks. Whereas overtraining is an accumulation of training and or non-training stress resulting in long-term decrement in performance capacity with or without related physiological and psychological signs and symptoms of maladaptations in which restoration of performance capacity may take several weeks or months. I have definitely experienced some of the overtraining syndrome, when you're working a full-time job, 12 hours a day, and you're adding in 10 to 12 hours of intense training per week, the ability to recover is not always there, especially if you're a little more prone to some high stress. But the basic difference is the amount of time needed to restore yourself to previous abilities, to previous capacities. So the base idea with it all is it's more about under recovery. And I know that they're like, oh, you're not overtrained, you're just under recovered. Same shit, different day. If you train too hard and you don't recover, obviously there's an issue. And if you do that over a longer period of time, the worse it's going to get. So they've done some of the studies, and they talked about it in the review here in the joint consensus. And it's kind of crazy because they did a study with racehorses, but it makes a decent correlation that when you have your recovery days and you have recovery modalities or movements, but you make the intensity of those days a little bit more challenging, they've found that, especially in those horses, which are racehorses, arguably your athletes, hopefully, that with more aggressive intensity on recovery days, that they get a little bit more irritable, kick in the stalls. So like we all have those athletes that have seemed quite a bit tired, a little bit cranky, and you know it might be that that they're just not recovering as well, or you know, a bad day, which is what makes diagnosing it so incredibly difficult. You know, but it's about this. I mean, honestly, as coaches, we know this. It's about the sleep. That's where your body regenerates, you know, if you're training college kids, if you're training anybody, how many of us actually get the right amount of sleep? And everyone's like, oh, you need 8 hours or you need 10 hours. As the joint consensus said it, and I actually like this statement, the general advice is to sleep for the amount of time that is required to feel wakeful during the day, which may vary considerably between individuals. So much like training loads and volume and intensity and work capacity and all of that is going to have to vary from individual to individual. So is the amount of sleep and the recovery. Some athletes can bounce back quickly, and some might need a little bit longer. So if you take the amount of effort needed for a 48 kilo lifter to be fully recovered versus a super heavyweight, like a 105 plus kind of lifter. I mean, obviously they're very, very different weight classes, but they're different genders, you know, and everything regarding that. You know, but it has been hypothesized that a lot of the sleep is about regenerating neurally, which is actually would be a really fascinating subject to explore a bit more. But sleep is recovery. They'll figure out exactly, you know, how much is needed for this intensity or that intensity, you know. But I mean, it's as we've all known, like if you don't get very much sleep, you feel a little bit a half step off, like your brain just isn't functioning. And if you do that over a longer period of time, obviously your body hasn't been able to hit the reset button. So, you know, like you talk about super compensation, and you go up a little bit and then you come down, and you go up a little bit and then you come down, and then you allow a lot of recovery and it should be going up. But if you're doing that kind of a super compensation model in training, but that recovery is not matching where it needs to be, all you're doing is driving yourself or your athletes further and further into the hole. And the further in you go, the harder it is to recover from that. That's going to be quite exhausting. You know, so that's where as coaches you need to make sure that you're thoughtfully programming everything, including those recovery days. We also all have those athletes that don't know what the hell a recovery day is, that you can't get them out of the gym, or if you do, they're off doing something else. You know, and eventually that's going to catch up to them. Now they might be the young 20-something, you know, male, whatever, they seem to do everything right. You know, you love the work ethic, but I always tried to emphasize with a lot of my athletes that you have to recover just as hard as you're working. And if you're not, then you're doing yourself a disservice. Eventually you're going to get injured. If you're not cognitively all there because you haven't gotten a lot of sleep, then you're prone to make errors in your sport. You know, if your brain's not engaged in what you're doing, obviously that's going to be an issue. But in regards to treating some of it, because, I mean, it's hard. If you can't diagnose something, then how can you treat some things? You know, but the joint consensus kind of talks about treating it as if it were a massive orthopedic injury. And it's going to take some time to recover. I mean, it's not just going to be like, poof, like one night you're all better. Because with true overtraining syndrome, it's a longer recovery because you've driven yourself so far into it. You haven't just reached a little bit, you went all the way up. You know, so they mentioned that, you know, rest and lighter training loads and intensities are really going to be the most effective recovery tool. You know, and the best statement is, the overwhelming impression, particularly in the evidence that has emerged since 2006, is that the emphasis needs to be on prevention of non-functional overreaching and overtraining syndrome, mostly by appropriate periodization of the training program with careful focus on including and executing appropriate recovery time into the training program. I mean, it seems logical. Do we always practice what we preach? No, guilty. But it's something that's extremely important for, you know, for an athlete's health, and sometimes it's even psychological. Like, we all get a little bit stale, especially if you've been doing a particular sport for years, not weeks or months or anything, for years. Some of us more than a decade at this point. You know, you love it, but then you do it so much that it's almost like overdosing. So even from a psychological standpoint, like, stressors aside, you know, you can just get burnt out on things like that. And if you're burnt out on the training and you're burnt out on life, and everything sort of, you know, compounds into one, you know, heaping pile of, I feel like shit and I'm not performing like I want. You know, obviously that's it. You know, that's something that you got to take a look at. You know, so it's more about taking a step back, checking your ego. You know, because, like, we all want to get better and we all want our athletes to get better. But I mean, if you're not allowing them to recover, then, you know, that's another problem. And that's where, like, some of those monitoring with, like, heart rate variability, which I'm still researching. But I mean, it seems simple, but as a multifaceted issue with overtraining syndrome, if you can't diagnose it, then how do you treat it? Well, it's more of a preventative thing. So I'm going to thoughtfully periodize my athletes. I'm going to program in recovery days and ask that they maintain a lower intensity. I'm going to ask them to get as much sleep as they can where it's appropriate for them. And I'm going to, you know, make sure that every now and then, like you throw something new in there. I mean, we've all got those athletes that, you know, will run through walls for days and days and days, and they could do the same thing over and over and not get bored. And we've got those other athletes that have about a 10-second attention span before they need something new, you know. But, like, explaining the process and why they need to work hard but recover just as hard is going to go a long way. And I've always wanted to educate my athletes on the why and the how, and not just not just be like, do this, do this, do this, and because I said so. This is why, because there is scientific evidence that says if you do X, Y, and Z, that your performance will get better, or that you'll remain injury-free, or that you'll reach some of those fitness goals that you've had. And, you know, this goes back to one of the earlier video blogs regarding, you know, evidence-based programming. So, I mean, if you have the evidence to back up your programming, that's good. And then if you have the evidence to back up that recovery is important, also very, very good. You know, and if you can explain it to your athletes, I think a more well-informed athlete is going to not only perform better, but they're actually going to trust the process. Ran out of a little bit of space on my phone for filming this, but the quick wrap-up is that overtraining bad, recovery good, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. In medicine, it's the dose-response thing. But overtraining versus overreaching, the summation. Overreaching is adjusting the program as such that there's short-term decrements to your training and your abilities, so you can get here. So super compensation, like you fiddle with it, so you get down here, you recover, performance goes here. Overtraining is you get too deep into the hole and it takes an exponentially longer time to come back out. But overtraining is a multifactorial thing, way too many variables. It's the physiological stresses, it's the psychological stresses, it's environmental. It's a lot of those intangible things that you can't necessarily keep track of, but having a training log that is both subjective of this is the actual work that I did, and the subjective of this is how I feel, and this is my mental state, and this is what's going on in life, can help create a better picture. You know, a pound of a pound of this, prevention of that, blah blah blah. But you know, and just you know, it's always about fine tuning that. A little bit of prevention goes a long way. Recovery is just as important, so recover just as hard as you're putting in the work. Sleep is important, so get as much sleep as possible. But these are definitely things that I'm going to be looking into a lot deeper as I get going, because I actually now have my placements, which is kind of British for internship. And I will be working with like Paralympic athletes, not like actual Olympians, but like para-athletes, or I think we call them in the US adaptive athletes, which is really, really cool. Where it's going to be an interdisciplinary approach to performance. So it'll be quite interesting because not only is it's not a normal healthy individual, but the different kinds of stresses that someone has if like they don't have function in their leg, or they're missing this or that. You know, so it'll be quite interesting, especially since this lasts for the entire next year. So very excited about that. It might be my dissertation, or I might be doing a little bit more a weightlifting based dissertation, as I've been talking with my lifting coach. He's got some really cool ideas that thus far no one has taken him up on in regards to researching it, so maybe this girl can get that done. But until next time, if you guys have any questions, hit me up. If you want the authors for this joint consensus, also let me know, and you can go find it and read it for yourself. It's like 20 pages long, not too bad. But until next time, bye guys.